Okay.
Hey there, John McWhorter.
Hello, Glenn.
Welcome to the Glenn Show, John. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's always a pleasure. I think you are my favorite guest. Can I say that, John?
You can say that because you're my favorite host.
Oh, man, we got the bromance thing going again. Yeah, well, so, John, I am just back from Seoul, South Korea. And
not S-O-U-L.
S-E-O-U-L.
Okay.
I tried to inject as much S-O-U-L into the place as I could.
Of course.
But I forgot my Tupac. So I didn't have that, I didn't have that thumb drive with my music on it available to get them jumping. I'm just back from Seoul. This is a great time of the year, summertime for an academic, I guess you can remember what that used to be like, right?
And now I remember what it is, because starting in the fall, as you remember, I now have a real job at Columbia.
I do remember that. Congratulations to Columbia.
As summer. It's no longer just that I have the same schedule all year. Everything changes in September, 2 courses a semester. So yeah, this is summer, and I am enjoying it and feeling it, definitely.
Great. So Seoul, South Korea was like a really eye-opening experience for me. It's my first time in Northeast Asia, and I had gone as, professor, give lectures at the university and at a think tank on development studies there in Korea. I have a former student who was hosting me, who's now a Korean student who's now working there and whatnot. And I had like my eyes open to the fact that the world is a small place, that this is the other side of the Pacific Ocean. It takes 10 hours from San Francisco by flight to get there, but it really is like a part of this global civilization that we're like connected up in. And like I just want to get out there, get in it, learn more, see and be seen, and like broaden my horizons beyond the limits of American self-absorbed politics and beyond the ghetto of racial discourse as a black professor. I want to be a global citizen, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry if that sounds, I don't know what, insufficiently committed to the cause or, whatever.
No, it's real.
Yeah.
It's very real. I mean, if you think about it, here's some context on that. Race in America right now is in one of those quiet phases in terms of the commentariat. We've got healthcare, we've got Syria. It's not one of the big things right now. But if you think about it, next year, we're going to be back in it, because there is almost certainly going to be the Supreme Court's decision about affirmative action. And probably they're going to decide against it. And also the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So in less than a year, people like you and me are going to be asked to have the sorts of conversations that you've been doing since the 80s, and me now, I've been doing it for 12 years. And the question is, what sorts of things are we going to say if you're feeling more like a citizen of the world these days? And I've had very similar feelings when I travel, and nowadays even when I don't. There's this debate that we have about black in America, but America has changed, just like the world has changed. What are you thinking, for example, when you start being asked, I imagine it's probably going to be in about March, about affirmative action and black and Latino students in the few dozen selective schools in the United States? That's the issue that we're going to be talking about. Does that feel the same way to you now as it did, for example, in, say, 1995? It doesn't to me.
Excellent question, John. No, of course it doesn't. It's not 1995. Neither is it whenever, what was the year? Was it 2000? The year that case came down, that I think it was like 2003, actually, Sandra Day O'Connor.
Affirmative action, yeah, that's right.
The Michigan affirmative action cases.
June 03, yeah.
Which was the most recent sort of high-level pronouncement on the parameters of it. So you've asked me, what am I going to say, and do I feel differently this time around? What an excellent question, because, it's not the same. So here we are, veterans of race discourse, and you're anticipating. You look down the legislative court calendar and you see, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. I agree with you, it's going to be a big fight. And I want to talk about that, and also about the affirmative action issue. I want to talk about that. But I really like the way that you put this in terms of how do we experience it, because, this is like the umpteenth time, here we go once again. Okay? And I can say some of the things that I don't want to do. Okay? I am tired of apologizing. I'm tired of making excuses. I'm tired of fighting the rear guard actions against the arc of history, which can't keep a special place for protecting black people from the ebb and flow of social forces forever. Okay? And eventually, we got to stand or fall, something like that. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not making a policy pronouncement now. I'm trying to make a kind of philosophical or existential pronouncement. How do you want to live in the world? Must you, will you, can you always be a victim? Can you always be fighting the good fight on behalf of the forces of civil rights light against the dark forces of conservative reaction? You know? I mean, damn. And like you said, a few elite places. Okay, so I was just in Korea. Man, they got cram schools on every avenue. It's the largest industry. Education is the largest industry in the country. People get engineering degrees and open up storefront tutoring services because parents are prepared to spend 10 and 15% of their annual income educating their children outside of the public sphere so that they can compete on the national exams and so that they can be excellent. Okay? So now, suppose it were the case that there were more Korean American students per capita showing up at UCLA and the University of Michigan than there were black and Latino students. There's almost certainty that that's true. Now we're going to have a policy? We got to have a affirmative? Okay, so we have a policy because there's a rationale, there's a reason, you know, the history of the thing. You can't have a diverse institution if you don't have some blacks, blah, blah, blah. Now we're going to fall on our swords about the policy? Now the policy is going to become the measure and the test of the progressiveness of the society and the extent to which the unfulfilled commitment of the magnificent promissory note that it blah, 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 you know, ad nauseum.
And you know,
I mean, I'm not going there, John. I'm sorry. I am just not getting back up on that soapbox and spewing out that spiel again. I'm not doing it.
I have a policy that's kind of like that. I mean, I think that it's all going to come down to the same old question, which is that a certain kind of person is going to say that America was founded on racism and that America must atone for it, and that there's societal and institutional racism as opposed to the old kind, and you have to understand that. And the grand question has become, is racism the main problem that black people face in terms of having trouble getting whatever black people are having trouble getting? And I think everybody knows, black and white, that it's not the main issue. Is it an issue? Yes, but is it the main issue? And for me, when it was the main issue, and even some time afterward, sure, you're going to have to shout it to the heavens, and the discussion is very earnest, and I can see why people were having that discussion, even up into the 90s, because historical echoes don't go away. But 2003, that Supreme Court decision, I think in the historical sense, that was the end of the 90s. That was the end of the way it made sense to talk about race up into the 1990s. And my policy is going to be this. I no longer will speak, except, with one exception, Glenn, you know what? It's you. I no longer speak about race live. Well, you, and if NPR has an actual intelligent question, I will do all things considered. I won't speak about race, though. I will not serve on a panel. I will not travel. I have disappointed several people lately who want me to go fly somewhere and talk about roughly endless variations on is there still racism in the age of Obama.
Yeah.
I very politely say I'm only doing language now with that sort of thing. I'll write about race, but I'm not going to do it live. That's over. And for me, it's the beginning of a gradual...
I got to tell you something, John. I hear you on this. Okay, so you're getting out, you're divesting, and let's talk more about that. But the thing I got to tell you is, I remember in 1991, when I left the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and I moved to the economics department at Boston University, I said exactly the same thing.
Really?
Well, not exactly, but I said, yeah, I'm done with the race thing. I'm done.
Wow.
I'm done with the race thing. I'm going to just do economics. It lasted for like a minute.
What happened?
Well, for 2 or 3 years, I immersed myself. I published 3 papers in the American Economic Review in a 18-month period. Myself and the very fine Cornell University economist Stephen Coate and the very fine London School of Economics economist Timothy Besley wrote a classic, excuse me for bragging, paper in the American Economic Review on rotating credit and savings associations, which are these, these informal organizations that you see all over the developing world that people use to amass capital in the absence of a financial sector and a banking system by pooling their funds and periodically lending them out one to another. And Stephen Coate and I published what is still a much-cited paper in the American Economic Review in 1993 on will affirmative action, speaking of affirmative action, eliminate negative stereotypes? The answer is not necessarily. Affirmative action can lead to a patronizing equilibrium, we argued in Economies to much effect in 1993. And other stuff like that. I spent a year on leave at MIT, and I never got out of the computer laboratory practically, and never got out of, game theorist lectures on advanced mathematical technique and this, and, wrote a paper that has never seen the light of day because it's too arcane on, imperfect competition between, oil producing, whatever. Okay, so I went technical. It lasted for about 18 months.
Because it was 1991. I mean, you had Clarence Thomas coming up in the Rodney King issue, and O.J. and the Million Man March. It would have been a lot harder.
Well, Rodney King was a part of it. I guess I'm reminiscing about the 90s now. But Rodney King was a part of it, and that L.A. civil disturbance riot of 1992 was a big part of it, and also the Gingrich revolution of 1994, the welfare reform debate, and all of that was a big thing that was going on. And my position at that time was as a conservative. I was with the Reagan people and the post-Reagan thing in the 90s, and people like Bill Kristol and whatnot, these were my buddies. And Clarence Thomas was not my buddy, but he was. I wrote a piece in the Boston Globe called "I Believe Judge Thomas." Oh my God! Please don't go back and read that. Please, nobody go back and read that.
Really?
Yes, I published a piece in the Boston Globe called "I Believe Judge Thomas." God help me, or whatever. I'll have to reckon with this on Judgment Day.
Nobody's thrown that in your face since? Because it wasn't on the internet.
I don't know, whatever. But I'm just saying, I was in flux. By the time you got to 1995, 96, 97, I had resigned from the American Enterprise Institute stuff. I had come out against Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein's Losing Ground. I had broken with the commentary crowd, Neil Kazadoy and Norman Podhoretz. I can still remember the 50th anniversary of commentary gathering at Harvard where Podhoretz was being feted and Commentary Magazine was being upheld as this great organ of global, political and policy reflection and innovation and neoconservatism. And Podhoretz stands up and says, we're all conservatives now. He says neoconservatism no longer is a defensible distinction from conservatism.
Oh, I didn't know there was a moment like that.
Well, he stands up at Harvard and he says this, and I thought at the time I made some brief comments, but then I wrote a piece that was published in an obscure Black-Jewish Relations Can't We All Get Along magazine that John Reeder, sociologist, published. I can't remember the name of it, but something like Dialogue or something like that.
One of those.
No one will ever find this piece, in which I say, come on, give me a break. Neoconservatism was liberals who said that the 1960s made the liberal establishment go crazy and people had lost touch with reality. And who said we have to critique these policies and go with what works. We never abandoned, I thought, the progressive aspiration of incorporating these people into the polity of being on the side historically of the solidarity with, et cetera, et cetera. Now you're going to assimilate me to the conservatives?
Glenn, is this what you meant in the New York Times Magazine piece on you where you said, it's funny, I have practically a photographic memory of that piece, this is before I knew you, where you said that gradually you began to feel that the people who you had thought of as your allies didn't really care about the fate of black people, which has always haunted me, because of course after a while I got to know all those people, and I've never quite come to that decision, but is this around...
Well, to say don't care about I think is too strong. Okay, and I think it's like ad hominem, and how can I know that? And it's a low way of arguing. Okay, but to say, I mean, maybe if by saying don't care about, I use that as a shorthand of saying don't have time for.
Yeah, I think that's what
are not prepared to integrate it into their worldview.
It's not a priority.
Not a priority.
Yeah.
That's something that.
That's what I took you to mean.
Yeah. But I was also saying something else there, which was that, when the music stopped playing, everybody had someplace to go on the right. Everybody was a Catholic, or they were a Jew, or they were something. Mm-hmm. They had their own program, identity, people, complex political aspiration, but they would begrudge me mine. You see, in other words, if I had some solidarity with the Negroes, then suddenly I had sold out neoconservative principle, and I was with the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Unless it was Shelby Steele and Tom Sowell and certain Negroes, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I don't want to disparage my former fellow black conservative guys. They're not perfect, but
you were only supposed to have an allegiance with them, but not with the others. You're saying,
right? And the others were like the enemies of civilization. Mm-hmm. They were Jesse Jackson. Now Jesse Jackson is, you can criticize him. He certainly has had a flawed career and whatnot. On the other hand, the guy spends his whole life trying to, see what happens out of the civil rights movement and push that forward to the urban black masses of the late 20th century. It's not an ignoble enterprise.
You're being a little generous with him.
Okay, maybe I'm being generous with Jesse Jackson, and I certainly won't mention the name Al Sharpton here. Okay, so I didn't mention that name.
He's better at this point, I think, because he called attention to police brutality. Anyway.
But here's what I'm saying, John. I'm saying the bell curve, to the extent the book Mary Herrnstein, 1994, to the extent that it speculates about the inherent genetic intellectual inferiority of African Americans, even though it will call forth a bunch of screaming, banshee-like complaint from the usual suspects about racism, is still dangerous. Okay? It's still dangerous. Now, the same kind of intellectual work that had cast comparable aspersions on other people's ethnic home ground would have been expected to call forth a condemnation in the interest of progressive values. To say that to neoconservatives in the mid-1990s was to get your face laughed in. Okay? It was to get your face laughed in. I was told, Glenn, you got to get off the fence. Right? You're with us or you're with them. Okay, now that's my mama you're talking about.
Right.
Okay, that's my cousin.
Right.
Chicago is not a hellhole of incompetent, genetically impaired losers. Okay? To the extent that there's losing going on there, it's a social failure in which we're all implicated. Kind of thing like that. Okay? Now, I can be for family values and say that too. I can be for limited government and free enterprise and say that too. Okay? And the fact that I'm a black man amongst a group of intellectuals in which there are no black people, okay, I'm not expecting you to say, I'm black, therefore you agree to my argument. Respect me! And respect the strivings of my people. They're every bit as dignified and every bit as historically important and every bit as at the center of the history of this country as are the strivings of yours. In fact, if I am not mistaken, my ancestors predate yours arriving in this country. It's going to be measured in centuries. Okay? So don't tell me what America is if you try to just gloss over a historic failure here that implicates millions of my fellow co-racialists.
Yeah, Glenn, I get what you mean about sometimes having cocktails with that crowd, and I know exactly that crowd. I don't spend as much time as I used to with them, but I know them. And sometimes you feel that the way I would feel it is that they only care so much about my part of this, and that when I'm not around, maybe some of them have some things to say that I wouldn't want to hear. Nothing primitive, but that they only care so much. But I felt that, actually, as far as the history goes, most of them felt that black history was just fine until sometime around 1968 when the Stokely Carmichaels and the Jesse Jacksons took over, and that was their big problem. So I didn't feel like the history was being dissed. If any of them felt that black people weren't as smart and that Charles Murray was right, they were too polite to say it around me, and maybe it's because I came along a little while after the bell curve that just wasn't in the air. But it wasn't black history they were denying, it was that they thought something had gone wrong when the Jesse Jacksons took over, and there seemed to be an almost maniacal desire for me to write mean things about Jesse Jackson. I remember that. Only recently has that stopped, that people don't salivate at the notion of a black person taking down Jesse Jackson. And he was a symbol, I think, for something larger. I didn't feel as dissed by those people as you did, and maybe it's probably because of differences between us. I felt that they only cared so much, but my thought was, well, why would they care all but so much? They're not black. I don't expect white people to care about that much, which ties into something else we should talk about. I didn't resent their lack of truly caring, as opposed to caring about Catholicism or Judaism. You're right, they did care about that more. It's because that's what, they are. I mean, how much would you expect them to care, and for what reason?
We're Americans, and this is the unfinished business of late 20th century American social development. And the failures that one is pointing to are failures of our collective strivings, and not the finger pointing at the liberals did it. This was my problem with America in black and white. Thernstrom and Thernstrom, 1998. No, I think it's 97.
Yeah.
And I wrote a long review in the Atlantic about it back then, and
you broke with them.
They broke with me, and they never forgave me for criticizing their book from the angle that I criticized them because they felt betrayed by it. And the angle I criticized them for was basically, I get the neoconservative argument, and it has its merits. But being right about the left being wrong is not good enough when we're presiding over an absolute catastrophe. Mm. And blaming the victim is also not good enough.
You said they lacked compassion, I seem to remember.
Well, I implied that I don't know that I used those words, but I implied, I said that they were ideologues in the service of doing battle with their enemies, and that...
you used the word pathos.
And I gave a kind of moral condemnation of their enterprise. I said, this is not an enlightened reflection, and whatever. I mean, you can look up the review. Anyway, long and short of it is that people, Abigail and Stephen Thurston were upset by my review of their book, and we never really spoke as friends again, although we had been quite close over many years. Mm-hmm. And I remain with admiration for both of them. And you talk about the Voting Rights Act thing, that we should come to that. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to say something else. I actually apologized to Jesse Jackson, and when would it have been? It would have been somewhere around 2002, 2003. He happened to be at some event at Harvard. I happened to be in the same room with him. We were having a conversation. He instantly remembered who I was and whatever. And we started talking. And it was about something I wrote in Commentary magazine in 1986. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this was like 14 or 15 years after the fact.
And he at least pretended to remember the piece.
I don't know if he remembered the piece or not, but he certainly remembered the controversy. And he may have remembered that I was on the other side of it, but you're right, he may have been pretending. Mm-hmm. And what it was he was running for president, so the piece might have been even earlier. It might have been 84, or it might have been when he was running in 88. I can't remember. Anyway, he was running for president. And people were getting at him because he had gone over and hugged Yasser Arafat and stuff.
That was 84.
Yeah. And so I came out and I basically said, this guy takes his left-wing politics and he sticks his nose in this global issue, and how dare he? Mm-hmm. Okay? I mean, he don't know what he's talking about, and he doesn't know what he's doing. That's basically what I say. And I criticize him as being misabusing the civil rights mantle by applying it to the whatever. Okay? Mm. And the reason that I apologized to him, John, is because I knew that in writing the piece, I was currying favor with my editors, mm-hmm. and saying what they wanted to hear, which was convenient to me to do because I wanted to do business with them going forward. But that I didn't really have either the standing, the depth of feeling, the depth of knowledge, or, the right to begrudge Jackson his, deployment of the legacy of King onto the global stage. You might have been right, you might have been wrong. It wasn't for me to stick my nose into it. I was doing somebody else's bidding on that. And it was true.
Was he gracious?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was very gracious. I mean, he could afford to be. After all, I was like this pariah person who was, trying to, sort of, I had been invited by Charles Ogletree to this kind of Gates, like Henry Louis Gates Jr. the black muckety mucks at Harvard, and Jesse Jackson is among them.
I know that event.
You know the event. Okay, so I had been invited into that. So I was just grateful to be present with my brothers, my sisters, striving for the light.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was gracious, but that was a long time ago. So let's talk about something else. Enough about me.
I have one for you, and this is something that really struck me, and I have to speak carefully because this is not ad person. But talk about white people and the caring. Another reason that I won't do it live anymore is because I feel, and also another exception, I love being on Chris Hayes, and if a race issue comes up on MSNBC's Chris Hayes, I'll do my bidding. But the fact is that on that show, I'm invited to talk about just about anything, so it's not only race. But I don't feel that white people and other non-black people at this point really care about it anymore the way they used to, and I'm not sure that they should. I was invited by a general kind of forum to speak about something, and I told them in the beginning, as I do these days, I'm not going to do racism in the age of Obama. Let me be happy and do a language thing. And they said it was fine. And then they had somebody else who is on the race beat and is increasingly popular. And this person, I'm not going to do the gender. This person.
This is Melissa. Harris Perry.
It was not Melissa Harris Perry.
Okay, then we just narrowed it down to the other two people. Never mind.
I'm not going to say who it is, but it was somebody of that caliber and that problem.
Well, if you want to preserve anonymity, you got to stop naming gender and race and politics, because with that three-part intersection leaves you with a very small set.
Yeah, I mean, the people who are watching this would at least be aware of this person.
Okay,
This person did a very nice talk. And we had to rehearse all this stuff in front of the kind of white upscale audience, and all of them were listening to this person doing their bit, and they're nodding and they're mm-hmming. And frankly, Glenn, I thought they don't really give a damn about this. They're enjoying the fact that they can display that they're not racist, and that's nice. But this person's talk doesn't look as important as the other 50 talks that are being given. People are pretending to care about this, and I thought, I am never again going to present myself in a forum where people have to pretend to be interested.
That's so interesting, John.
With language, people do care, and I enjoy doing it, and I get to crack jokes, and nobody's worried about my authenticity as to this or that. And I really felt funny after leaving that, because I thought this was signature for me. Because the other person's going to keep doing what they do, and they do it well. But that person would have been me 10 years ago. And I've really moved on, and there's a part of me that feels like I'm betraying the younger people who I think look to me as somebody who has a valuable message about race, because everybody doesn't read, or everybody isn't always going to read what you do. But I'm at the point where I will only do it in the coldness of print, where I feel like I have complete control, I don't have to get on a plane, and it's not about me as a human being as much. And I don't know, am I betraying? No,
you're not betraying. You're just trying to survive is what it sounds like to me, and you're trying to maintain your dignity. And it I think speaks very well of you that you're sensitive to being patronized by an audience, and that you find that something that you could not tolerate. Okay?
I won't.
I mean, many people are happy to settle for being patronized by their ever-growing audiences. And that, I agree with you, is a sorry condition to have fallen into. And at the end of the day, you're going to feel dirty. And then when you look back on it, how can you respect yourself? Okay? And I agree with you that the country and the world are moving on, and that this post-civil rights moment is precisely that. I mean, whether or not we live in a colorblind society and blah, 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 I mean, you could argue the sociology of it. I agree with you that we don't, and that, the race is still important, blah, 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 blah. But the fact of the matter is, man, I mean, I'm teaching students that, the world is moving on, man. The world is a fast-moving place, and it's moving on. And, frankly, we African Americans are an extremely privileged people. Mm-hmm. When I think about what people are willing to do to try to gain residency in this country, okay, from this global village that we live in, where there are 300 million Americans and 6 or 7 billion people, okay, and we got an institutional framework and an ongoing historical dynamic and economic opportunity and a burgeoning thing, land of free and whatnot. It's not a bad place to be. Okay, a lot of people want to be here. Now, we're here, okay, and at what point do you transition from being a supplicant and being a person whose condition is meant to draw forth sympathy and who is requiring of external intervention on behalf of large moral ideals. 2, you become an agent. Not that these things are mutually inconsistent, they are not, but I'm saying that somehow the burden, the balance, shifts from like the negative to the positive, man, where we should be carrying weight. Okay? Why has Africa not developed when South Asia, India, Northeast Asia, Korea, I was just there, you wouldn't believe it, China, are moving and pulling people out of poverty and whatnot, okay? And we African Americans, if we're going to have a black shtick, it ought to be about something that has something somehow to do with that, in my humble opinion, We ought to be deploying our moral and cultural capital on behalf of noble, global enterprise for the vast majority of humankind who do less well than we, who are less well endowed than we. Our narrative of victimization and complaint ought to be reformulated and mobilized on behalf of a transnational humanistic narrative that tempers the dark edge of American imperial and militaristic assertion. Okay, I'm sorry for the preachy tone of that, but I'm just saying, I don't have any patience anymore for these thumb-sucking, whining, excuse-making, sorrowful people who have inherited all kinds of opportunity lying right at their doorstep in a world that is ever shrinking and where the vast majority of mankind are less well placed than they. So, no, I don't say African Americans have an exceptional responsibility relative to other Americans to be humane, stewards of our special dispensation that we have inherited here in this wealthy, free, and prosperous and globally leading society. But I do say that our posture ought to be outward looking, and we ought to be standing up straight.
Yep.
I mean, I'm sorry, I don't know, somebody's going to refute this sermon, then go ahead and refute it, man, because this is definitely my view.
And no, the sad thing is that nobody would refute it. The kind of person who you're talking to and who, metaphorically, I'm talking to, would listen to you and say, oh, yes, of course. But in their heart of hearts, what interests that person most, and I'm now talking about a certain kind of especially smart, educated black person, they think that the most important thing for black America is to think about and to contest institutional racism. That's what excites them most. That's what they're most interested in talking about. When the news happens, that's what their ears are pricked up for. And you can talk, you can sermonize, you can talk about how we need to look forward, etc. But for them, until this institutional racism is gone and white America has done some sort of atonement, then everything else is just posturing, and it may be interesting, but it's not the main meal. And I think that that is one of the most tragic socio-cultural mistakes that any group of human beings has ever made, to suppose that advancement cannot happen in a meaningful way until all remnants of racism and its psychological effects are gone. That is a weird mistake that 1960s America conditioned a whole people to swallow. And unfortunately, to say that is to have a great many people think that you are a terrible person, you're naive, you're immoral, you're a snob. That's the next thing. You look down on your own people for expecting them to not obsess about racism. But of course, what about what happened in Korea? What about what happens in Thailand? What about what happens in India? Human beings don't need perfect conditions to succeed. But if you're a black American, often if you say that, then you're thought of as an apostate. It's tiresome. It's wrong.
Okay, I gotta say two things, and this is like pushback. Okay, one of them is stop and frisk and racial profiling, and then the other one is the voting rights and voting suppression. So, and I want us to discuss both. Okay, so I agree completely that the shtick of kind of anti-racist and looking for racists on every bush, always playing that card, always blah blah blah. Needs to be laid to the side, and that, no, you're not going to live in a perfect world. And anti-Semitism still reared its head from time to time, long after Jews were well incorporated into American society. And, yeah, there's an anti-defamation league, and people are worried about it. You know, Foxman is out there and others, and you hear them. But it somehow it doesn't have to be that the thing is going to be made perfect, and yet people can still succeed. No, blacks are not Jews, and they're very different stories, histories, and so forth and so on. But still, you can just ease off of that a bit. I agree with that completely. But I want to say there are things going on where racism is implicated and where it's relevant to make that argument. I distinguish, actually, between this, I'll just say my view, you can say yours, the stop-and-frisk case on the one hand, and the voting rights case on the other. The stop-and-frisk thing is just, to me, out the box wrong. Okay? It is an assertion of state power on behalf of values which I think are opposed and rubbing up against other values, and I believe those other values are anti-racism values, and they should prevail. The values of public safety and making the streets of New York City nice and pretty for, safe and without impersonal violence. I understand that what we're talking about here partly is about guns and robbery and murder and rape and violence. I'm for public safety, not against it, but still, in a city of 8 million people and in the scheme of things, when you deploy, when you have hundreds of thousands of stop, when you have huge racial disparity in the thing, when you have presumptive suspicion, when you have people who have to acclimate themselves to being frisked, to being stopped, to being interfered with, to being whatever, when the state's tentacles get that far, when 999 out of 1,000 other things are not somebody with a pistol who's getting ready to rape somebody, when you can't even get into a taxi and be riding around without a cop pulling you over if it's after 2 o'clock in Brooklyn and you got the wrong look on your face because he thinks a taxi driver might be in danger and so forth and so on. When you live in that kind of a world, and the racism that's behind it, that's behind the mobilization, is discernible, somebody ought to speak out about it, my view. On the voting rights thing, I think that 1964 is almost 50 years ago. And I think you cannot permanently indict this county or this state below the Mason-Dixon line as being presumptively incapable of discharging the state functions of overseeing electoral participation and process because of that history. And I think that the idea that I need to use the voting apparatus in order, as a permanent matter of American politics and policy, to so configure the representative institutions of the legislatures that they reflect what I presume to be racial interest, and that is measured by the racial identity of the people who are sitting in that seats. I'm just going to say it again. Abigail Frenchman is right about that. Okay, that's not the way you want this democracy to develop in the 21st century.
No.
When the vector of that dynamic here is largely going to be Latino, Hispanic, when you've got African immigrants coming, they happen to be black. They're coming in large numbers. And you've got a huge number of people from the Asian continent, from the various societies there, who are also making their way into society who are non-white. You know, you can't let Jim Crow drive your 21st century American governmental institutions and law.
No.
So, you know, I'm sorry if that's apostasy. I'm not against extending the Voting Rights Act, except I think at the end of the day I probably am.
I would agree with all of that. I think the Voting Rights Act was designed for a really nauseating Jim Crow circumstance, and it was legally a little odd even then. And of course, many people seem to think that you have to keep it the way it is until there's no racism. And of course, it depends on what you call racism. Are the reasons that some black people are being prevented from voting now, and they are by Republicans, is that about racism, or is it about a naked and nasty kind of pragmatism because so very many black people vote Democratic? I think it's obvious that what was going on in the 60s and before is not the case, and I would say that that particular part of the Voting Rights Act needs to go. There are other ways of addressing the problem. Stop and frisk, yes, everything you said I agree with, and I would just add that I think that we're stuck with the idea in the air that it's crucial to being a good black person to think of racism as more important than it is. And that's not going to go away. There's nothing we can say. And if that's true, it's something that you can grow up thinking. You can inhale that in the air. It's part of the mood of the community. And nothing is better designed to keep that going than having it be a rite of passage for young black men to be stopped and often harassed and even beaten up by the police for no reason. Every time I see something like that happening, you can see it in New York. I'm getting too old to worry about undergoing it. You are watching a community being taught to keep thinking in that counterproductive way. And so it makes me sick, and I see I see nothing that the stop and frisking at this rate is doing to counterbalance that societal poison. I did a piece on this in the New York Daily News recently, and I've written about it elsewhere. It's a truly terrible practice, and I'm surprised that somebody as smart as Mayor Bloomberg is so pacific on it. when he's asked about it. He should be able to see what poison it is. So I would agree with you on both points.
Interesting, John. Very interesting. I just want to say, you're not as old as I am, and when I lived in New York City last year, I was stopped on the sidewalk within 100 yards of my front door of the apartment that I was renting on a bicycle and detained by police officers for riding my bicycle on the sidewalk. And that was clearly a, quote, stop-and-frisk move. I was forced to produce ID.
Right.
So forth and so on. So, I guess it depends on the circumstances. Or maybe I just look younger than you. Just kidding.
Now, you were on a bike on the sidewalk.
I was on a bike. I had rode it down the stairs. I had gotten on the sidewalk, going to the end of the block where I would have gone into the street to ride up to Morningside Heights to go to my office at Columbia for my apartment in Harlem near Central Park. And I was detained. Police officers forced me to produce identification and wrote a citation for me for riding my bicycle on the sidewalk. And when I got to Columbia, I was almost run over by bicycle riders on the sidewalk. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I want to tell our listening audience and you how I mean, you just made what I thought was a very interesting declaration. I would not accept invitations to do this. I'm not going to do that because I don't like to feel like this and I don't want to talk like that. And I agree with you. I see that. And I've got my own piece that I've made with this burden that we carry. This is the black intellectual man's burden of having to talk race all the time, having the Obama in the age of race in the age of whatever. And what I'm doing is going global. Okay, I've just decided if I got 20 years or whatever I got of being alert and being able to do stuff, I'm going to go global. The world's a small place. I'm going to cast my vision to a larger horizon. I'm going to try to consider everything within the context of the global situation of communication, of interdependency, of security, of economic, of ethnic, of movement of population, of historic, of interpretive, of narrative, of identity. Nationalism is a really problematic concept for me right now. What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a black American? I'm a citizen of the world. My connections to people are not merely and only determined by some kind of nationalistic inheritance. What's the imperative of the economist in this kind of current condition? What are the deep problems that we should be confronting? And as a race man, quote unquote, as an African American, and as I said, I think we have responsibilities because basically we're privileged relative to the rest of the world, but we also have a story to tell. The world is really interested in that story. We have deep knowledge, I think, about these issues of ethnicity and subordination and striving and dignity and self-assertion and identity and whatnot. That is relevant to the Roma in southeastern Europe. That is relevant to the untouchable, low-caste, non-caste of South Asia. I'm going to Nepal in a couple of weeks, man. I'm going to a conference in Nepal on group identity and affirmative action. I'm going to give a keynote address talking about affirmative action in American ethnic history as a way of encouraging and stimulating conversation amongst an international group of people who are trying to think through the problems of caste and ethnic inequality in the new sort of emerging democracy of Nepal and what their policies. I'm going to Kathmandu. I'm not bragging. I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing this kind of thing. Okay? I'm going to transcend the ghetto. Sorry if that sounds self-aggrandizing, because I know that it is, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Life is short. This is the only life I got. I'm darned if I'm going to spend the rest of it, regurgitating some 50 and 100-year-old, by now very parochial American racial stuff. I mean, that's not who I am. That's not what I'm going to do. Sorry again, but that's what I'm doing.
I think that's going to serve posterity a lot better. And I reiterate, I think that the discussion that we're talking about was crucial in the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. But to just keep on saying the same thing as the world changes. I think in Kathmandu, one thing that you should say, every now and then I've had somebody from South Africa ask for advice about this in the written format. And I've always said that affirmative action is very important to address historical wrongs, but that it just has to be treated as chemotherapy. There has to be a time limit. The idea can't be that it stays until society is perfect. There has to be a set time when it's going to end, because people's agendas will change and people's reasons for preserving it will change. And you're just going to have a mess if you're not very clear on what the time limits of the policy are. Are you going to tell them something along those
Well,
lines?
I'm stimulated by your advice and your suggestion, John, and I take it very seriously. I don't know that I'm going to quite say that, though I take your point about the issue of the permanence and the chemotherapy example may be a good example. But even an oncologist is not likely to say a priori, well, you can do it for 6 months and no more than that. They're going to wait for the scans.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to see how you tolerate it, and they're going to make a judgment about it. So the idea of a time, I mean, this is a little bit like the troop withdrawal problem.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? We have to get the number of troops down. Okay, so everybody can agree with that as a principle. You have to have a kind of not do this permanently. We're not going to be there forever.
Mm-hmm.
But a person might say, you don't want to announce a time limit in advance because the implication of doing that is that the enemy will then coordinate around your announcement.
Right.
And this is only an analogy, but likewise here, you may not want to announce a time limit in advance because you may not have the knowledge in hand at the time that you need to make that announcement that would allow you to prudently judge how far it goes. But the idea that you got to worry about lock-in and permanence is a good idea. Maybe at the end of the day, there's no solution other than a time limit, even though it is fraught with the kind of uncertainties and likelihood that it might need to be revised and be extended. But you see, if you revise and extend, then the commitment to the time limit becomes questionable by the very act of revision and extension. So it's not an easy problem here.
I suspect that a time limit is the only way to do it, and the advantage would be that the population that's being helped is aware that these unusual conditions are something that will only exist for a certain amount of time, and therefore there won't be the danger of the notion innocently setting in that these differing conditions are the way it's supposed to be for we other people, that that's just the way we be, so to speak, and that it's unfair to subject us to normal conditions, which is what I think happened here quite innocently. Most people can't imagine that you would say to Black America, even to affluent Black America, we are not going to give you special consideration and admissions because you don't need it anymore. There's just a sense that that's somehow racist, that's not the Black way. And that's understandable, but the only way to keep that from going is to say
I don't agree with you, John. I don't think it's the only way. I mean, I'm not sure about this, but here's what I want to say. We are in a state of exception. This is what I want to say. Affirmative action is a state of exception.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's already saying a great deal. But what I mean by state of exception is we have a compact or understanding that basically organizes our law and our interrelations with one another. Affirmative action stands outside of that. Okay, this is what I want to say. So does extrajudicial killing by the President of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not a crazy connection. I'm trying to emphasize the notion of exceptionality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, by saying that, what I say is we are self-consciously aware that what we do out of necessity is at variance with the long-term structures to which we want to be committed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and in doing so, we sort of emphasize the special character of the condition that we're in. But how long that condition persists is not something that we need to necessarily announce in advance, having acknowledged that we live in a state of exception.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be a counter-argument to what you're saying. But what you're doing is helping me a great deal, because if I just say both sides of this argument in Kathmandu, I've got 20% of my keynote address. John! I didn't think doing a blogging head was going to help me with this.
There you go.
John, we're going to be talking race for at least another couple of BHTVs because we've only got phase one of our disengagement from talking race.
And you know we could do this affirmative action for a whole one.
Yeah, we could, and we'll probably have to do it. Okay, John, in about 1 month?
I'd say definitely in 1 month.
Okay.